Live for God Studio Productions.
This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
We are in the last part of the study on the laws. Jesus is addressing the religious laws, the spiritual laws that were forced on these people. And as he's doing this, as he's teaching from this area in North Galilee, just north of the Sea of Galilee. And he is on this sermon. We call it Sermons on the Mount, really, because it is a series of things that he taught, maybe over a week or a weekend, I don't know. But in the process of doing that, he is addressing what was so oppressive for the people. They were forced to obey these spiritual laws, and the Pharisees forced even more laws on them and made up laws to force on them so that they would be even more spiritual, as they said. Truth of the matter is, it was oppressive. And so Jesus is addressing this very issue of the law and saying to them, the law can't fix the reason for the law, and that's the real issue. That's the real problem. And so he's addressing that, and he's going through a series of those laws, and today we're looking at the last one of those. So we're in Matthew in chapter 5, and we start with verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Not even the tax collectors do the same. And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So, this law about loving your neighbor and hating your enemies was a bombshell. It was almost like Jesus saved the best for last when he was talking about the laws, because he mentioned something very, very new to them. This time in this law, and beginning with verse 43, Jesus interestingly quotes from the Old Testament law, which is love your neighbor, and then he mashes it together with a current religious law of the day, which was to hate your neighbor, to hate your enemy. Some of you may combine them either way you want, but he was saying so you are to love your neighbor and you are to hate your enemy. Now, love your neighbor and hate your enemy seem to be like one and the same, don't they? Like they go hand in hand. And what was happening was there was this Old Testament law, which was love your neighbor, but there was this Pharisaical law that had come along, which was hate your enemy. Now, the love your neighbor part came from Levitical law. It's in Leviticus 19:18. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, this was the Old Testament law that was given to them, and they knew about that law. But they also knew about this hate your neighbor thing, which was not Old Testament law. The Pharisees taught that one should love those near and dear to them. But Israel's enemies should be hated. That's what they taught. So they taught that you were supposed to love your neighbor, love each other, but you were supposed to hate your enemies. And that such hatred was God's means of judging their enemies, which is the way that many Muslims believe today. You know, they believe that you care and love for each other, but you hate your enemies. In fact, in the Essene writings, the Essenes were the third largest Jewish sect of the day. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And the Essenes were known for communal living. They generally tended to live in communities together. And they actually wrote in their own writing. The Essenes were the ones who had the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, the ones that hid the scrolls. And they were prolific writers. They wrote a lot of passages, a lot of teachings on their own. And a number of places in their writings, they explicitly command love for those within the community, but hatred for outsiders. Now, not necessarily outsiders Jews, but outsiders that lived in the area that were not Jews. So Jesus quotes this mashup of Old Testament law and current Jewish law, which the people that he was talking to would have completely understood.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.